I have a lot of things to say and actually a lot of slides to show, which I hope will, by way of introduction, give you a sense of the exhibition, Times Square 1984, the postmodern moment, which has precipitated this retrospective look back at Times Square 30 years ago. It is the first of 4, possibly 5 programs with dates yet to be announced. And during my slides, and this is a view of the exhibition at the museum and some poor installation shots, but here is a view of Times Square, and I'll launch into this history that frames the place between its beginnings in 1905 when the newspaper headquarters of the New York Times named Times Square. And in these other lectures, we want to explore different chapters. This evening's is really about the role of government and the role of government officials, planning professionals in the shaping of the place that became Times Square. And if I go back and then realize that the title that I gave you here is how today's Times Square's design was encoded in the 1980s. The idea that we really want to explore frames this 30 years ago and jumps forward to the present because it's irresistible to discuss the success of the plans. But what I want you to realize in this evening's discussion is that there are people in the audience like me and like many of the people I see here and have already spoken with me, who remember the days on 42nd Street and Times Square, remember them perhaps as the bad old days. Some remember them with nostalgia, and there have always been different perspectives on the take of Times Square. But there are many people in the audience, including my students from Columbia who are looking at Times Square, who weren't born yet. They weren't even, their parents may not have even met. They are the Lion King generation of 42nd Street. The first time they probably ever encountered the New Amsterdam Theater was in order to be taken as a preteen to see a play or a movie or go to Madame Tussauds, where the family-friendly Times Square is the identity that we have today. But we're going to try in the videos that I just saw you, and which you can see on our website, and in this quick overview of the topics that we'll explore tonight and which the exhibition explores, I will introduce during these slides our various speakers, but you all know who they are anyway. So beyond the exhibition and beyond the origins of Times Square, when it was already at the beginning of the 20th century a place of entertainments, of hotels, of tourism, there are really 2 Times Squares we're talking about. One is the northern section of Broadway and the intersection of Broadway and 7th Avenue, known as the Bow Tie. And you can kind of see it here in this 1920s view when the Great White Way is shown in simple electric lights. You can see it in this plan where we've marked out the main towers. This is probably not going to work. There it is. The towers of the subject of the exhibition, the Park Tower Realty set of 4 skyscrapers designed by Philip Johnson and John Burgee in 1984 and announced with much reaction in the architectural community. This is the Times Square of 42nd Street, though, to look back here a moment at the bow tie, at the Marquis Marriott colored above, and then at the 4 towers that were to be, but not until the late 1990s. So the other part is the 42nd Street. The Urban Development Corporations, the state's oversight project of the redevelopment of Times Square, and you can see Carl there in his youth. I don't think this is working, but you can see him anywhere on the lower left. And in a wonderful video that I invite you to go to, called The 11th Hour, that was a kind of Charlie Rose-like discussion where Carl and I agree he demolished Brendan Gill in the debate about the future of Times Square. So we have the state and we have the city. This happens to be a model from John Portman's office when Portman was designing in 1973-74, under the Lindsay administration, what was called then then the Portman Hotel and became the Marriott Marquis. This is the plan for the pedestrianization of Times Square 30 years ago, which was advanced by the Department of City Planning. So city planning always had a hand, and it was Herb Sturz, who's here to discuss tonight the initiatives of urban planning, urban development, and city planning as one agenda in marriage with, but somewhat in contrast with, the motives of the urban designers and architects who are here tonight to talk about their work on 42nd Street. So by 1965, the Times Tower, as you can see, has been completely defaced from its historical terracotta ornate ornament. But this is the look of Times Square North with the Times Tower in the center. And of course, this is the way it looks today. And what we see is not just pedestrianization and certainly signage of a new technology, but skyscrapers surrounding the space. Skyscrapers framing the space. And skyscrapers really engendered the debate. But skyscrapers were also the deus ex machina of the salvation of Times Square in terms of economic development and trade-offs in development. So that in the very first urban renewal plans for Times Square, which I'm going to show you in other images, but as part of the urban renewal effort in the 1970s, the Portman Hotel that you see here was typified the defensive character, the mega structural scale of architecture in the 1970s. Of course, it was built 10 years to 13 years later in that same style, which many people criticize. But if we go back all the way to 1978 and 79 in terms of the urban planning agenda of 42nd Street to clean up the blight, to as it turned out, condemn the land and treat it all as one urban renewal site. What you see here, and Don Miller's in the audience, when he headed the city at 42nd Street, as you can see at the very top with some of the illustrious names of planners that were involved. This private initiative, which was funded in part by corporations but in large by the Ford Foundation, did something very important. It established the sites for the skyscraper development at the intersection of 42nd Street. And as Carl and I have had discussions, the scheme that was first proposed was very important in order to treat the whole block between 7th and 8th as a single site. And over the next 10 years, litigation and various plans eventually cleared the opportunity for that to happen. But when this plan was showed to Mayor Koch in 1979, he scotched it immediately. He called it Disney, he said New York should be about seltzer, not about orange juice, because he thought it was far too tame. And that led to the 42nd Street Urban Development Project, where Alex Cooper and Cooper Exton established the urban design guidelines, of which this is the cover of that plan. And you can see the sites for the skyscrapers. You can see the historic towers that line 42nd Street between 7th and 8th there. Alex's urban design guidelines, you can see in drawings of 1980, maybe even 82, you can see are quite different than the buildings that Philip Johnson and John Burgee designed for George Klein of Park Tower Realty. Those buildings represent a postmodern reaction that was very much of the time. They were large, as you can see. They were harmonious, all of one style, all one expression, an expression that caught a lot of attention in the press and elsewhere, but an expression that many architects responded to as saying, that's not the character of Times Square. And this is the way Johnson always wanted to see his models at eye level. This is the way that Philip Johnson would have looked at this project. And you can see what he wanted to create was a sense of a new urban ensemble, a plaza unified by a single language, in this case of a kind of classicizing architecture. That riled a lot of people, including the Municipal Arts Society and Lance Brown with the NEA and the Times Tower site competition, which is kind of the centerpiece of our exhibition. And I just show you some of the images of the various entries that were published in Oculus, and you can see many of them, well, it's actually 21 in the exhibition. They range from kind of one-line jokes and entertainment kind of architecture to much more serious. This is Rick Bell's scheme and his team's scheme, which is a satire, but to very serious considerations by people like Rodolfo Machado of the nature of architecture and urban place, and very. It was a moment which hit a lot of young designers as pregnant with meaning. There was the opportunity to engage in a civic discourse, to rethink architectural discourse, and this is very much a part of what our exhibition is about. Even George Klein hired Robert Venturi in order to create a scheme as the centerpiece once he heard that a vacant space wasn't appropriate, and Venturi produced the Big Apple that you see here. So the UDCs, the Urban Development Corporation scheme for 6th to 7th Avenue, you can see their context model here, had inserted into them the Johnson Burgee projects. That's not what, and here they are in two different iterations, one the early one from 84 and another from 89 that you see here, where signage is applied, because really the UDC and especially Rebecca Robertson in the later years held the feet to the fire of the developers and the architects in order to hone to the urban design guidelines that Alex Cooper had described and that I showed you a little bit of, and I will show you more of in a moment. But then there's this other story of the northern section of Times Square, the northern push of the theater district and the zoning district that is the sub-zoning district of the theater district, that was experiencing the incentivized pressure because Herb Sturz and the Planning Commission wanted to move from the east side 3rd Avenue corridor development to the west side. The Planning Commission rezoned the city in 82 after much discussion, and as we'll see in a moment, revisioned rejiggered the guidelines in 87 after some exchange with civic protest and people like Hugh Hardy in discussing the importance of the bowl of light and of necessary signage. But one of the problems here was on the west side, the new buildings, which were allowed by the new zoning to have more FAR and greater bulk, and got an incentive and to include theaters like the Portman Hotel here with the theater in its basement, was having the repercussion of destroying historic theaters. And this is in 1982. The Helen Hayes and Morosco were demolished in order to to clear the site for the Marriott. This brought a whole nother group of stakeholders into the mix, and you see the actors and theater owners who had somewhat different interests too. You see Joe Papp being interviewed at the demolition protest. So there was this over-identified equation of stakeholders, all with somewhat different perspectives and needs of what they wanted to get out of deals, and that's the politics of city planning and of zoning. There were architects like Lee Harris Pomeroy who drew these maps of the current development of Times Square and on the north and the possible build-out under the first 1982 zoning laws. And as a cautionary, as a warning of what could come, a replication of 6th Avenue, which was the most immediate west side model of the tower in the plaza architectural development. And so there was an enormous amount of local protest against that. There was an analysis, these are also Lee's drawings, of the use of air rights and the advantages that the theater owners might gain from the transfer of development rights, something that we're still talking about today. And then there were the people in the urban design and planning profession who took as their principal topic saving the character of Times Square, the visual character, the razzmatazz. There were also the dinginess, the edginess. There's all of that. Was a part of the discussion and certainly a part of the press debate. This happens to be planner Gary Hack's image that was done for Lynne Sagalyn, who's one of our our panelist tonight is going to ask some questions because I want to recommend to you her book, Times Square Roulette, which she will be talking about at greater length in one of our programs on October 27th. That date has been set. So this nature of the experience of signs, of the ad hoc character, was something that everybody was worried would be lost by the Johnson and Burgee schemes, and which, to be specific, Cooper Exton countered with some urban design guidelines that you see hypothetically drawn in these lovely drawings for Times Square, right with Hugh Hardy's renovation and landmark preservation scheme for the new Victory Theater that you see just to the left. So I would keep this image in your mind as I show my very last slides, because nothing happened for a long time after 1984. This is 1997, and you can still, this is the Times building underneath some very primitive kind of signage if you compare it to today. But you see, there are no skyscrapers there in 1997. There's a construction site for 4 Times Square on the left. A full 13 years later, not a column has been put in the ground. So what happened in Times Square? How does it change so quickly? There have been many stories written. Nobody's written as good a one history of it as Lynne has, but there's been certainly an enormous amount of discussion about it happened overnight. Obviously, it didn't. It happened because of Disney that turned the tide. Obviously, that wasn't the case. But the argument of the exhibition and part of this evening is that the buildings like this that were designed by F.X. Fowle, Reuters building here, are really buildings that, in effect, are designed by government and urban designers. The scheme that I just showed you in the drawing by Alex's team could well be the base of 3 Times Square. So the premise for, and this is 42nd Street in not Hugh's scheme, but in the 42nd Street now, commissioned architects who were Robert A.M. Stern and the designer Tibor Kalman. Yeah, thank you. So the argument of this afternoon, this evening, is that the government established through the creation of the sites for the skyscrapers, through the urban renewal plan from 6th to 7th Avenue, through the rezoning in the 1980s, and then rezoning again in 1987, the basic character of Times Square. And in order to vet that premise, we have panelists, but I think first we have some slides by Hugh Hardy, which is the only other set of slides. So I think you're going to come up and talk about those. Okay? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So which is which? Click forward. Okay, the laser pointer too. I thought it would be helpful to make the distinction between 42nd Street and Times Square. They have different histories. They came to different results, and I thought it would be valuable to just look at the origins. There's Oscar Hammerstein the first. He was the grandpa of the Oscar Hammerstein that did all that stuff with Rogers. With Richard Rogers. And he was a remarkable man. He sold cigars. Cigars were what the boys needed in those days, and he gave him access to all the wealthiest people in New York. He was a fantastic salesman in his ability to build theaters and opera houses. There wasn't anything he didn't build, but he couldn't hold on to his property. It would all slip out of his hands, and other people would take over. But he was the first person to build a theater on the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway. He actually built a theater complex because in those days, you also put theaters on the roof. Prior to air conditioning, you performed on the roof and had all kinds of, in the New Victory, when it was the Republic, actually had a whole garden up there with cows. It's quite remarkable. But what's important to understand is that the nature of the culture of the theaters then was quite different than all this business about signage and light bulbs. That's the site before he built his theaters. That's 42nd and Broadway. And that immediate property is what became the Times Building. And just beyond it, you can see 7th Avenue. And that was the corner where Oscar Hammerstein built his theaters, and that started a whole transformation. Out of that came his theater, which you see here in its second incarnation, called the Republic, and it was then sold and became the Belasco. David Belasco did extraordinary things there. Avi's Irish Rose went on for hundreds of years there, and finally it was sold to Minsky. Minsky had the idea that what burlesque needed was double runways, and so that was a room unlike any other. But what's important to see is that, yes, there were light bulbs, and yes, there were some signage, but it was more about the facades themselves. This is what we inherited when it was our turn to do something about the New Victory, because Carl Weisbrod had this insane idea that the trouble with Times Square was, yes, it needed renewal, but maybe urban renewal wasn't the way to go. Maybe demolishing everything and building brand new buildings wasn't the key. It had been in New York for so long. Maybe one should just take the theaters, put them back into use, and out of that could grow the rest. The facade here was an amazing transformation because it was suggested, preservation and restoration being high. I don't think you could do this now, but the thought was that we should put back the original staircase. That staircase goes up to mezzanine level, and underneath it was the box office and the main entry. And you can see where the big sign is, it says New Victory. There used to be big pots, and they'd pour flaming oil into the big pots to announce the starting of a show. But by and large, this was a very chaste place in terms of architecture. It doesn't have the glitz and the stuff that you think of when you say Times Square, and it certainly doesn't have the kind of displays that are there now. The other thing to say is this was shot just as the New Victory was put in place, and look at the general character of the city. Since then, it was because the New Victory was an institutional theater, did not depend upon box office, was a nonprofit theater, and brought to the scene a whole new form of entertainment, which is a subject in and of itself. Obviously, a commercial theater depends upon the box office. If you have a hit, it's fine. If the hits close, eventually the theater gets a bad name and the theater closes. So the thought that Disney would come on to 42nd Street would never have happened if they were the lost leader. There was too much at stake. The New Victory being committed as an institutional nonprofit theater made Michael Eisner more interested, and because of childhood associations, he thought maybe, just maybe, they could restore the New Amsterdam. Rebecca Robertson mentioned before as a hero in all of this, but what is interesting to me is the marketplace is what brought this back into being. Popular entertainment, which was the legend of the place, is really what saved it, not urban renewal. And the arrival of Disney on the scene, all hell broke loose, and you know what happened as a result. Now, that's a different story than Times Square. Here, it was a combination of movie houses and their much more elaborate signage displays, which turned into selling products. And of course, that's what Times Square is so good at doing now. I love the American Apparel idea that if you go and buy enough, you can go outside and discover that you've been put on the billboards in a living, live color, and you can take your cell phone, if you come from out of town, take a picture and send it to your mother right there. There you are in Times Square. All of that manipulation is part of the current scheme, and of course we know about this part. We were talking, well, I won't go into that, about Times Square and New Year's Eve. And here we are again in the current circumstances. On the left, is it there? Yes. I can see the belly of the theater, the Marquee Theater. I'm not sure anybody else can, but behind the Kodak sign, that has been partially removed, and Vornado is currently building, in case you wondered what that structure is, a 5-story sign, the entire width of the block, and goes around the corner itself. It will change the character of Times Square. It will change all that wonderful competition of one sign with another because it'll be so dominant. I have no idea what the results of that will be. It's just to say that it all keeps changing.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you. So I tried to introduce in context our speakers. We do have a program, but I think everybody knows, everyone here. But just in case Herb Sturz is not known to some of the younger and newer to New York, Herb has been many things in New York government and in not-for-profits and in a whole range of worlds. And I think he was one of, if not Carl's first boss, and I wanted Carl to be able to contextualize both his multiple experiences in Times Square. He's had so many different jobs saving Times Square with wearing so many different caps. But I think Herb, when he was the chairman of the Department of City Planning, counted Times Square as one of his greatest accomplishments, but it came at the end of a cycle of a much broader vision for the West Side, which was the rezoning of the West Side in the early 80s, and then the theater sub-district. So I asked Herb to talk about that, but he can talk about whatever he likes.
Okay. Good evening. Thanks, Carol. Actually, Times Square has lingered in my DNA since New Year's Eve, 1939. It was my 8th birthday, and Times Square seemed joyous. Happy people, happy balloons, confetti, toffanetti, and a large brown horse guided by a mounted cop. The horse, not the cop, affectionately nuzzling my chin. Seriously. Fast forward 40 years. 1979, I'd just been appointed deputy mayor for criminal justice by Ed Koch. Times Square was desolate, threatening, dangerous, defined by strip joints, drug addicts, pushers, prostitutes, pimps, and 3-card monte players. The first thing I did as deputy mayor was recruit wonderful Carl Weisbrod to make the deuce safe, or passably safe. Carl was charged to prevent crime in Times Square. A hopeless job. Carl knew that law enforcement alone would never make Times Square alive and well, but he persevered. Still, New York had lost control of 20 vital acres in its very heart, perhaps the most storied 20 acres in the world. Lo and behold, a year later, 1980, I became chairman of the City Planning Commission. And my first challenge helped turn Times Square around. Working with my colleague from the Public Development Corporation, Phil Ahrens, we sought good uses to drive out the bad, reclaim Times Square. But there already was a plan, or I should say a proposal. It was called, of course, the City of 42nd Street, driven by corporate and foundation leadership, lots of money, media support, and political power. Koch called the plan, as Carol mentioned, orange juice, Disney. He liked seltzer, New York. For a year, Bobby Wagner, my marvelous predecessor at city planning, negotiated with the city at 42nd Street. Bobby was one of the century's great public servants. He conveyed admiration and respect for the proposal, but he never said yes or no. So I said no to the city of 42nd Street. I told them the city would issue a request for proposals. We weren't about to sole source 20 acres in the heart of Manhattan. This was public space, public domain. New York City would take on the redevelopment of Times Square. Eventually, with the New York State's Urban Development Corporation, led by Richard Kahn and Vincent Tese, we needed their experience, clout, and of course, their powers of condemnation, eminent domain. It took 4 years. In 1984, the Board of Estimate approved the plan. They didn't have to do it by law, but politically there was no way other than having them approve it. Well, Times Square is still being built out today. It is not perfect by a long shot, but we saved all but 2 of the theaters on the mid-blocks and created others under the absolutely brilliant leadership of Cora Kahn and Marion High School.
I think Cora's here tonight.
Well, is Cora? I know Cora's here. There's no fear on the street. Before, you scurried with your head down from 8th Avenue to 6th Avenue. Now, instead of contending with pushers and pimps, there's the Cookie Monster, the Statue of Liberty, and Mickey Mouse. The naked cowboy joined by naked cowgirl. And of course, tens of thousands of office workers sharing space with tens and thousands of tourists from every continent.
Thank you. Carl?
Well, it is, for me, an honor, really, to be following in the footsteps in many ways, and following here today, Herb Sturz, my mentor of so many, many years, and a person who's had such a profound influence on the city. You know, as people often say, victory has many fathers and defeat is an orphan. I think of what's happened in Times Square over the last 30 years or so as a great urban victory. And there are many fathers and mothers who were responsible for that, and Carol and Herb and Hugh have mentioned many of them, the brilliant Rebecca Robertson and the indomitable Cora Kahn and Marion High School, and there are so many others. But I would just say that the Times Square of today and the urban revitalization of the West Side would absolutely not have happened were it not for Herb and were it not for Mayor Ed Koch, who made, both of them made tremendously tough decisions on what was, as has been alluded to, an extraordinarily controversial endeavor, in many ways a controversial endeavor in terms of urban design, controversial endeavor in who is Times Square for, a controversial endeavor in terms of the financial resources that the city was foregoing or committing, a controversial endeavor from the perspective of so many property owners who had been in Times Square and who did not want to be dislodged, and a controversial endeavor, as Carol alluded to, because there were long periods when nothing happened in Times Square. And many people who had initially supported the Times Square project, as Herb mentioned, the glorious day at the Board of Estimate in 1984, when literally for the last time, every single voter on the Board of Estimate, some of you may remember the Board of Estimate, know that for the most part, elected officials at the Board of Estimate were represented by surrogates. The only time, the last time that all the principals appeared and voted at the Board of Estimate was to support the 42nd Street project and the transformation of Times Square. And from that day forward, controversy erupted, and that unanimity that existed in 1984 disintegrated over all of the issues that have been alluded to. But throughout that, Herb and Ed Koch really stood firm and assured that Times Square would be revitalized. And it has been revitalized. And when I think of where I am today and what I do, and the fact that as many of you who are involved in urban planning and city planning, and I know certainly Alex and Herb, who've both been at city planning, and understand the controversies that arise every single day, and the intensity and the fights over land use in New York, it gives me tremendous comfort to think back and say, for all the controversy that we endured, we have transformed the city of New York in a major, major way. And I'd like to just spend a few minutes sort of separating what is often conflated, which is urban planning and urban design. There's a lot of controversy about urban design, and I'm going to leave that to Alex and Hugh to talk about with respect to Times Square. But I don't think it can be questioned that as a matter of urban planning, Times Square has been an extraordinary success for the city of New York. It opened up the west side of the city in a way that would never have happened if Times Square hadn't been revitalized. We would never see Hudson Yards or anything along the west side of mid-Manhattan were it not for Times Square. It was very controversial as a matter of, was this a giveaway to developers? But it has triggered an enormous river of city revenues over the last 25 years. Times Square, 42nd Street in the 1980s was contributing in city taxes less than one medium-sized office building every year. For the last 10 or 15 years, it has literally supported the Economic Development Corporation and all of its activities through the revenues and pilots that have come from 42nd Street. And perhaps most importantly, it has transformed the image of the city. When one thinks of Times Square in the 1970s or 1980s, it was not just a depressing and dangerous place with all the data that flashed on the screen that Carol showed earlier, but it was really a window on the soul of New York, and that window was pretty depressing. And it was a symbol of urban decay. And today, it is a symbol of the city's resurgence and revitalization. And it has been done in a way that many people, I think, felt wasn't going to happen, that it was going to be turned into an office park and a sterile office park, that the mid-block theaters wouldn't be for people generally. And fortunately, thanks to, particularly to the incredible work that Cora Khan did, the mid-block of 42nd Street, Times Square itself, for all of the chaos, for all of the crowds, for all of the activity, I don't think anyone can say this is a place for the chosen few. This is turned into a modern-day populist location, really reminiscent of the pre-World War II era. So I think that we have a great debt to pay to Herb, a great debt to pay to Ed Koch particularly, and a great debt to pay to so many people who worked on this over so many years. It has been a success in terms of land use planning. It's been a success in terms of transportation planning because we concentrated density and bulk and enormous number of workers in perhaps the most dense and transit hub of in the city of New York, including Grand Central Station. It has been a success in terms of economic planning, financial planning. Lynne Sagalyn may talk about this, but this was an enormously creative endeavor, and particularly 42nd Street. It was undertaken right after the 1975 fiscal crisis, and was undertaken using private sector money and public sector powers, that is the power of condemnation, without the city really putting up virtually any money at all for what has been a $2.5 billion project that has resulted in so many benefits for the city. So I will leave it to the urban designers to talk about urban design, but I would say as a matter of urban planning, this is a model for other cities and for New York on future projects.
So, Al, do you want it?
Yeah, I feel
From
like
the podium?
I have to either eat Rice Krispies or drink vodka at this time. So can I stand up over there?
They'll turn your mic on. So as Alex Cooper moves to the podium, I already introduced him through the small tranche of his work at 42nd Street in Times Square, but of course he is one of the world's best known urban designers. And I think we're going to ask you to respond to Carl's idea that city planning and urban design are different.
You can't change the rules now.
Oh, okay.
That's
But I do know that you said once to Paul Goldberger in an article that I read is that the definition of urban design is to tease out the character of place and to preserve it. And so I hope you are going to talk about what your sense of
During
the character.
questions will be fine. Extraordinary being here with two of my former bosses. I've worked for them for so many years. It's shocking. But had I known I was speaking last, I might have brought some images, which I did not bring. So this is sort of something in the middle as opposed to something at the end. So Carol asked me to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. So I'll try to do that. That's not easy for me. But I want to talk about how the design emerged at Times Square, because whether it's reviled or loved, it really was a design. But I want to mention first 2 precedents. One was featured here tonight. The city at 42nd Street really was, but it was an exhibition hall, and it had a very different purpose from the commercial purposes that emerged later. It was a very sensuous scheme and a very serious scheme. Fred Papert ran the Development Corporation. 2 of my closest friends were the lead designers on it, Richard Weinstein, about to be the dean at UCLA, Jack Robertson, about to be the dean at Virginia, and about to be my partner. They both worked on that, as well as Shermayeff and Geismar, Davis Brody, and my dear friend Hugh Hardy sitting at the end over there. So everybody was involved in it, and all the reasons it did not happen, others here can talk about better. There's a second precedent. And I finally just found this out this week. The design guidelines for Battery Park City Commercial Center were published 6 months before 42nd Street. So I had no idea we were doing both at the same time. I'm glad we got them straight as to which is which. But it's a very complicated mechanism. And people were quite suspicious of guidelines, but at Battery Park City, it lured in an enormous amount of developer interest. It showed that the design guidelines could be a viable development tool, and Olympia New York, of course, built the whole thing with one architect, whom they picked, and they were selected because he followed, Caesar Pelli did, the guidelines more closely than any of the other competitors. So he didn't feel slave to them, he bought into them, and it flourished. The development guidelines for 42nd Street, however, were published in June of '81, scant 6 months after Battery Park City. There were 230 pages of guidelines, including a supplement. That's a lot of detail that we had been encouraged at Battery Park City because that detail was embraced and the results seemed to be headed in a positive direction. We, of course, felt that the guidelines were essential, especially in a place like Times Square, where investment was much riskier even than Battery Park City. So that's the purpose of guidelines, after all, to let you know what's happening next door and that you won't be surprised when that happens. But I do think of Lincoln Center, where there were in '65, when there were 5 sites, 7 architects, and they sat down for 3 weeks trying to agree on principles and trying to agree on guidelines. They came up with 3. 1, we'll all use travertine. They all bought into that. Number 2, we'll all do 1 story the same height, and they pretty much did that. The third thing those 7 architects agreed to was a principle of luminosity. That was something that meant something to every one of them. So Philip Johnson's first building at the theater, 3 solid walls around and 1 glass facade facing the plaza. So those were honored more in the breach, actually, than those guidelines. The guidelines for 42nd Street were pretty complicated, but they were grouped into 5 things. And this, I'll just make it as absolutely simple as it can be. The first bundle was density and use, and that was pretty simple. The uses were very flexible. There was 7.6 million feet, which was in the existing zoning, so that was kept. And there was a large-scale plan employed that allowed the density to be moved from the center of the block to the avenues. Pretty straightforward and simple, conventional stuff. The second bundle of guidelines had to do with public improvements. These were mandatory. And of course, saving the 9 theaters was the most fundamental principle that finally everybody bought into. But there were a lot of transit improvements that were mandated, subway stations, a new 41st, not new, an improved 41st Street subway tunnel connecting 8th to 7th Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. Plenty of public improvements. The third category was circulation, which really had to do with an active street life, and putting lobbies and transparent walls in front of them. That was all written into the guidelines. The fourth category was bulk, and I'm getting right to the end. Of course, the purpose of the bulk regulations were to ensure the primacy of the pedestrian circulation, but it did deal with the street walls, the setbacks, the meeting of the new buildings with the old preservation areas and how you had to step to do that. So those bulk regulations were pretty restrictive, as a matter of fact. And then finally, there were the special features. Special features are the things that the architects involved were a little anxious about. The facade expression, the signage, the lighting, the materials, even the color, and the historic preservation. There were principles and details about each one of those built into what you must do on every site. Well, I have to tell you, to finish, a nice anecdote. Philip was hired by George Klein to do the plan. Well, he came over to my office, then a little hole at Rock Center that I'd been given, and had 3 rooms, 4 people. It was great. And Philip came with George Klein, and there were officials from UDC and the city. There had never been so many people in that little office. It took 2.5 hours to explain all of the details that were in those 230 pages. When we finished, Philip, whom I'd worked for years before, took me by the arm, took me out in the hallway. He said, "Alex, you know I can't do these guidelines." I said, "Philip, why?" He said, "Because it would be your design then." And he walked out of the room and did a scheme which was, shredded, as it might have been for being so bland, when in fact the guidelines were quite rich and active. But Philip managed to, wash them down quite good. Thank you.
Well, they didn't build the Johnson-Burgee towers, and indeed, as I'm arguing, they did build yours. So in the end, you triumphed. Lynne, would you like to make some comments and ask some questions?
Sure. It's a pleasure for me to be here to talk with colleagues and old friends. Writing a book on Times Square was a monumental task, and it wouldn't have happened without the cooperation of all the players. And my job tonight is to put some questions to them, but I first want to take 2 minutes and just draw out some of the big themes from what Carol said and Herb and Carl and Alex and Hugh. There are really a lot of lessons in urban design, lessons in city planning, and certainly lessons in the politics of executing an ambitious plan. And the plan for 42nd Street and Times Square, there are really two plans, but they were related, was really ambitious. And it was an ambitious plan that followed on the heels of what many considered to be a difficult demise of Westway and a difficult controversy over Westway. And the thought was New York City could never think big again. And the 42nd Street Times Square projects were really New York's success at thinking big. And so there are a couple of themes that I want to bring out relative to Carol's overall theme for this program. And one is that the experience at 42nd Street really recast the scope of public possibility, and it reinforced the belief among many people, and particularly planning circles and policy analysts and people in the deputy mayor's office, that it was possible for cities to reshape what the market was going to deliver, and it was possible to do that through public policy. And the interesting aspect here is you had two very different sets of public policy. You had public policies towards zoning and rezoning West Midtown, which Carol talked to, and you had a really, at the time, new approach, the public-private negotiated development approach, which Carl spearheaded at 42nd Street, the development project. And so these were two very different policy initiatives that were designed to work together and complement each other, and I think they did in ways that we're still benefiting from. The second takeaway of this project was that the process was unbelievably messy. It was messy, noisy, but fairly democratic. It was also, reflective of the DNA of this city. It was fractious but open. That's sort of the way we do things here. It's not quiet. And there was a tremendous amount of opposition, but I'm the first one to say that opposition, and opposition to many public initiatives, is very productive. And what was productive about it was that it forced the actors and the decision makers to keep the symbolic character of Times Square, even though it was dressed up in new towers. But it was clearly the opposition, spearheaded by the Municipal Art Society, that led to a plan that was more in keeping with the character of Times Square. And the takeaway there is, and I've said this before, is that ambitious projects do not always succeed on the first plan. Actually, the first plan becomes kind of platform for discussion and debate. And then it's the second plan, sometimes it's the third plan that succeeds. And that's sort of the way we do things here. And as Carl can attest, there were legendary development hurdles. I wanted to remind him of there were 17 major development hurdles, and that's including the 47 lawsuits as one development hurdle. The third lesson here is that cities have, and it was alluded to, cities have a latent fiscal muscle. They find money when they need to find money, or they find a fiscal strategy to make a project go when it doesn't require cash. We saw that in Times Square, where it was the private dollars and public powers. We see that at Hudson Yards. I mean, I remember Dan Doctoroff, reading the Times Square roulette and saying he was really influenced by the off-budget character of how it was financed. And so that's a real strategy, because cities are fiscally constrained, especially in New York City, and they have to find creative ways to finance their big ambitions. And I think the Times Square project, the 42nd Street project, was a harbinger of that. The last point I will make, and before asking questions, a really important one, is that public leadership makes things happen apart from market and political forces and institutional arrangements. We had all those things, but it was the leadership of Mayor Koch, Carl Weisbrod, Rebecca Robertson, Cora Khan, and a whole bunch of other supporting actors and actresses in this that made it happen. And it's that leadership, you know, with an unwavering political commitment. And what was very different about Times Square was you had a continuity of leadership. You had a continuity of leadership at the state level. Remember, this is a state and city project. And so you had Vincent Teasy in the head of EDC for a long, long time, then succeeded by Charles Gargano. And there was a continuity in terms of tenure for both of those people, and also continuity in implementing and sticking to the policy of the big plan. And sometimes we take that kind of leadership for granted, and it really was a hallmark of how 42nd Street got done. So with that, I'd like to turn and ask a few questions. So Herb, you know, when you were head of city planning and spearheading this project, these were controversial kind of policies. How did you think about the politics of getting them through? I mean, you were right, absolutely on target when you said you didn't have to go to the Board of Estimate, but politically you had to. So could you talk a little bit perhaps of your political strategizing about how you were going to get this big ambitious project that was going to be controversial through?
Well, it's easier in hindsight because at the time I didn't know. I didn't really know. I just had a job.
We're about candor.
And you just go in a direction and you want to make something happen. We agreed we wanted to make Times Square happen and turn around. And as Carl said, I had behind me Ed Koch, and he is a tremendous force. And I don't think in other iterations we had someone as strong behind Times Square as Ed Koch was. And Mario Cuomo was very helpful. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, I think Mario Cuomo also came to the Board of Estimate, the only time a governor ever came before the Board of Estimate in order to support a project. And I remember he called me about 2, 3 in the morning while it was still being argued to find out what was happening. But there were just a lot of smart people from the public sector and the private sector had it was desire, greed, whatever else, to be a part of this. And also just a feeling of wanting to be with something great that could happen and would be historic. It is Times Square. And it just struck me that it had to happen. I didn't have any real logic, but I just assumed if you press hard enough and think you're fairly smart and getting smart people. And of course, I got Carl, and that was really smart. And we made it work.
Hugh, I want to ask a question related to something you said in your slide presentation. You talked about the preservation of the 42nd Street theaters. Could you give some context to that and how that related to the demolition of the 5 theaters for the Marriott Marquis? And because those things were, in my mind, very much connected, and the audience, could you sort of talk about that?
Well, it's interesting because you see, as was explained, this was a state project, and all of the history of 42nd Street teeter-totters between the state and the city and the private sector. It's everybody together. For these theaters and these theaters only, a special commission was set up. It was not the New York City Landmarks Commission. These were people brought together, distinguished people, of course, who could opine with credibility about the past. And the interesting thing was, because they were all new at the game, they were terrified. They were absolutely concerned about making a mistake and being held up to ridicule because they had permitted or encouraged or done something really awful. But because of that, as I said earlier, I don't think you could have gotten the staircase put back if we had just sashayed up to the New York City Landmarks Commission. I think that the discussion there would have been quite different. And one of the members of this group had said to me when we were worrying about what to do with the facade, well, you should just put the staircase back. It wasn't my idea. I thought that would be absurd. 42nd Street sidewalks have gotten narrower and narrower and more narrow over the years, and the thought that you could unleash that giant piece of stone and walk up and down it just seemed absurd. It isn't exactly the way it was. It actually used to come out 5 feet farther. But be that as it may, they had the courage to do something that I think would not have been in the rule books, because our commission, and I think it's correct, is horrified by replication. It doesn't like that. I could tell you long stories about 18 West 11th Street and the battle and the question about should there be replication, and the commission felt absolutely not. So, is that the answer?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Alex, I have a question for you. You know, you were in the Department of City Planning and the Urban Design Group at an incredibly formative time. We can't remember because we haven't seen a Department of Urban Planning like that before. Since rather, not before. They were really pioneering something that was invaluable to the city, and I think many of us wish that it was still around or would resurrect itself. As a policy tool, can you talk about why urban design guidelines were viewed as controversial? You mentioned that in your remarks, and we kind of almost take it for granted that urban design lines are a positive thing for certainly for large-scale urban planning, where it's going to happen where development's going to happen over phases. But we might forget that it was once controversial.
I'll get to that in 1 second. I can't believe we've been here for an hour and a half and the word pornography has not come up. And I must tell you, for 10 years, I heard that word every day going to work. And then when I moved my office to 43rd Street and 8th Avenue, in 1981, because I was so proud of the plan, for the first 7 years, we had to escort any female employee after 6 p.m. to the subway station. It was 7 years of misery being on 43rd and 8th, which is just about okay now. There's a very short, simple answer to your question. The Urban Design Authority comes from the mayor. And that's true in every city, whether it's Joe Riley in Charleston. But John Lindsay backed those ideas, put the developers in his office, whether it was Olympic Tower or anything else, and he let these designers at 30 years old who didn't know anything lord over developers, and it was amazing what he did. Total and complete support. So when you get that, we were very lucky. We dreamed up some things we had no idea what they were about. But they sort of worked and still work now. But it takes politics at the top to pull that off.
Herb, did you want to comment on that?
I only wanted to do a mea culpa on the pornography. We felt, and our lawyers, that the project would go down on First Amendment grounds if we completely eliminated sites that had some pornography on it. It was a free speech issue. And I didn't know it was going to affect you, Alex. No. Maybe we would have done something else.
Carl, I have a question for you. Many of the panelists have talked about the 42nd Street piece and the northern Times Square piece. These were two very separate policy modes. Can you talk about how they meshed or how they conflicted, to sort of tie it together for the group audience?
I will, but of course I have to comment on pornography first. I will say that just so those of you who don't remember the Times Square that Alex is talking about, there were, when I started in Times Square in 1978, 200 sex businesses operating in Times Square. And the second day I was in my job that Herb recruited me for, I got a phone call from a reporter based on an interview that Ed Koch had given on the radio, saying that he had ordered me to put the operators of every single live sex show, that is, sex shows where performers were actually having actual sex on stage, in jail. And that was the first date I ever had with my wife, as we went around to every live sex show to see if they were actual or simulated. That was...
Is your wife here tonight?
She's not. She doesn't like to remember that day. But in answer to your question, Lynn, I think that, there was a certain symbiotic relationship between what happened in the greater Times Square area and what happened on 42nd Street. And initially, 42nd Street was, for very, very good reasons, seen as the key to transforming the rest of Times Square, because it was the heart of many of the problems in Times Square, and actually the place, almost a petri dish, where criminal activity was concentrated, and a launching pad, really, for criminal activity that existed throughout Times Square. Because of the challenges of the 42nd Street project, but also because of the expectation that 42nd Street was going to happen, the rest of Times Square started developing before 42nd Street itself. I don't believe it could ever have happened if there wasn't a confidence that 42nd Street was going to be redeveloped. And there was no way that 42nd Street could be redeveloped given the disassembled nature of the block and given the unbelievable social conditions on that block without government intervention. But the greater Times Square area, to an extent, really started before 42nd Street itself, but was highly dependent on it.
Carol, are we opening it up for questions now?
We will in a minute, but since we've already been once down the line, and there's one topic which I think Hugh might be able to speak to in a separate hat, and that is the civic engagement, the protests, for example, of the Municipal Art Society, the turning out of the lights, all of the lights of Times Square, the commercial lights, and then the one single sign addressed to Mayor Koch, "Hey, Mr. Mayor, keep the lights bright in Times Square." Could you comment on the role that you played and then the larger role of civic engagement? And I would like Herb to respond, because it became city planning's problem, in effect, that the Patrician Municipal Art Society took a stand against city planning.
I'd be happy to do that, and I just want to reinforce one other thing. It seems to me, in general, what you have succeeded with these discussions in what you asked for, which was not a discussion of one aspect of the revival of Times Square, but all the aspects, all the different things that it takes in a city to pull off something like this. And isn't it's so valuable to understand how each generation builds on what's happened before. And you see it right in front of you here. But I want to reinforce, before I specifically answer your question, the nature of the people involved, because yes, it's about planning and abstract ideas, and yes, it's about form making in my profession, and yes, it's about light bulbs, it's about all those physical things. But without the people that's been mentioned and their motivation and drive, it doesn't happen. It's the activities that brought Times Square back. The activities that Carl was describing could be transformed in the same real estate into what we now go and celebrate there. It's amusing to me that New Yorkers complain that it's too much like the West Coast, that it's too Disneyfied. Well, that's just because we resent the fact that we're no longer the film industry. It all began here. Everything began in New York, and we could take pride in all that stuff. But in point of fact, a lot of the entertainment values of the new 42nd Street are created elsewhere. They're created in Southern California. It's about a suburban culture presenting itself here. We don't like that. We're snobs. But the interesting thing to me, I have to speak about what Cora and Marion High School accomplished with the new victory, because it was something as innovative as you could be. Can you imagine, in the environment that has been reconjured up before you, thinking that a theater for young audiences was a good idea? Not children's theater, not cutesy-poo red, white, and blue things, but actual productions from all over the world, it turned out, that would be available for young people to experience the performing arts, and that it could be a subsidized nonprofit activity, not a box office things. Those two brave concepts were as wacko as, and they were very much fought against by very knowledgeable people, as anything could be. And I have to repeat that because of that individual commitment, Disney came. Disney would never have come to 42nd Street first. They would be a Target, they would, and so forth. And it was, of course, Michael Eisner's romance about his youth in a theater called the New Amsterdam that made it all happen. But beyond that, the corporation would never have committed to be seen in public as the one legitimate performing arts place on 42nd Street. And of course, it too was innovative. I truly believe that The Lion King deserves its commercial success. Now announced as the most successful thing. I think it's more than Phantom of the Opera in terms of the overall cash on the line. But Julie Taymor and the others really did invent a different form of musical theater. It is, I mean, there's the Disney part and the Julie Taymor part, and I'll leave it there. But what I'm trying to suggest is that it was individuals and activities are as important as plans. The Municipal Art Society obsession was a few of us crazy people who thought you couldn't have New York without Times Square. You couldn't have this crazy city not have a place that mad. You couldn't have New Year's Eve in the rest of the country without Times Square. You couldn't just be there without Times Square. And so the political necessity and the fun of getting that night when we turned all the lights off and were able to say to the community at large, is this what you want? Do you recognize what you're going to miss when it all becomes a corporate center? Because the prejudice in the development community was that signage was bad. Signage was commercial. It was somehow...
It was also the planning community.
Yeah.
Planners were totally against this kind of
Signage. Oh, yes. Ugh. And ironically, the Municipal Art Society, when it began, fulminated about billboards and did everything possible to prevent them. So having them be leaders in the championing of Times Square and the ugly thing of commercial signage is a sort of a delight, and it comes again from individuals. I'll be quiet.
Well, in order to recapture that experience of all the lights going off in Times Square, I don't know if Peter Bunch is here, but on... well, we no, but we have a video of it actually happening in real historical time, which is on the museum's website, and so you can search it there, and you can see the lights go off one at a time, and you can see Laurie Beckelman and various other people, Ellen Burstyn, commenting on that. So civic engagement made a difference. People made a difference. I wonder, Herb, if you could just, before we open it up to questions, comment briefly on how you accommodated the civic protests into your planning.
Well, we accommodated by letting them talk and listening, but we had a different vision of retaining Times Square. And Municipal Art Society wanted it as badly as we did, except the Times Square that I knew late at night, or going from 5 to 6 at night, going from your work or to work, differed from what I felt was a lot of romanticism about, was it Brendan who talked about the essential dowdiness of Times Square? I didn't see any essential dowdiness, frankly. I saw what Carl did. I saw there were 200 pornographic uses that were driving other people away. And I thought we just had to develop this for the whole city. And I think it could and has accommodated Municipal Art Society. I want to go back to the one point also you mentioned about the New Victory. And there, Cora was fierce in insisting that the entry be on 42nd Street over her own board. Many members of the board thought, oh, you can't go that far. You can't bring children. And the basic thought for us is, of course you bring children. We listened to Cora, we listened to Marion. And I think that was a critical decision. And also leading to the Lion King decision across the street. Exactly. You had to do it, and this is where it came. There were many issues that had to come together, and you had to persevere over time. But in a way, from 80 to 84 isn't that long a period to get the basic political approval from the day that the city and state committed to Times Square.
I think we're ready for questions, and I'm not sure how we're going to actually operate. Do we have a microphone to pass around? If anyone has a question, raise your hand. We'll get the microphone to you. Carl, is there anything you want to say in response to Herb's remarks? Okay, so we have 9 minutes, 10 minutes for questions. In the back, with the microphone, yes.
I'd just like to know if anyone...
I don't think it's on. But just yell it out. You can go ahead and yell your question, or I'll repeat it for the history.
The question I have is, can anyone speak to the Clinton special zoning district that kind of delegated or designated 42nd Street as a growth corridor in exchange for preserving some of the residential buildings in Clinton?
Repeat the question.
You talked about the connection between the Clinton district and preservation of residential. They were connected, yes. We thought these were both good things to happen and wanted it to happen. We wanted residential development. We wanted special district. It was all together, and we wanted to do whatever we could to buttress the further development to the west side. And God knows we had that wonderful Zeckendorf program with Cravath, Worldwide Plaza. That was a huge, huge impetus.
Other questions? Wallace in the back. Anybody?
I can speak loud.
All right, go ahead.
Looking at these tables here, they remind me of the tables that were in Grants. Remember Grants on 42nd Street, the west-south corner? And then if you didn't want to go so cheap, you go across the street to Nathan's on 43rd Street between Broadway and 6th. But that's not my question. My question is there a law that I read somewhere that says something about there must be 120 feet of lit signage on any new building that's built in Times Square? Is there some truth to that?
I don't remember exactly what the requirements are, but on large buildings, Tim. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, we wrote the zoning that mandated illuminated kinetic signage in 3 zones. One was at the at kind of eye level low, the next was at marquee level, and the next was at a more distant level. And these were
And this is Paul Siegel.
whatever. In any event, this was the Theater Advisory Council's zoning recommendations. Herb put together a group led by a wonderful man, Orville Schell, and it had 12, 14 people who represented the theater owners, the civic groups, developers. They kind of, it was the theater unions, Ellen Burstyn, who was then head of Actors Equity, Bobby McDonald, who was head of the Stagehands. Joe Papp, right? Oh boy.
Alex Cole.
No,
All right, we're devolving.
Jerry, shut up.
And we didn't all agree, but we all came to a consensus that the kinetic illuminated signage was fairly essential. And actually, Fisher Morantz, Jules Fisher came in and showed us some really fabulous ideas. This is what, 30 years ago now? Just really amazing ideas about what you could do with signage. But we felt that signage was the important ingredient to keep the character of the place and not let it become Park Avenue.
You know, and I'll just let me just add that the signage that originally existed in Times Square, as I'm sure both Hugh and Alex will attest, was originally there because these were assemblages, and there were no. They were the only thing that was making any kind of money. So the developers felt that when their assemblages became development sites, they shouldn't have any signage anymore. And there was a great deal of resistance to it initially. And of course, to impose something like signage, and especially moving kinetic signage, and to, in effect, through urban design, create cacophony in a certain way, is a zoning resolution challenge, to put it mildly, and literally new means of measuring lighting, the distance of certain lights to the street, emerged out of one of the many innovations that really emerged out of this endeavor. And of course, today these are money makers for the property owners. I'll just make one final point on this, which is just again to the gutsy decisions that were made at a time when the city's finances were not in the most healthy condition. Morgan Stanley, which was then wanted to move to Times Square, and the city very much wanted to see it move to Times Square, initially said they're not going to move there if there's super signs. And the city did not modify the signage regulations, and ultimately, some years later, Morgan Stanley moved there anyway.
The irony of that is I asked the question, how much signage was actually put in place in the 5 or 6 new buildings in Times Square relative to what was mandated? And amazingly, 25% more than was mandated was put in place voluntarily, and the biggest addition was Morgan Stanley.
Wasn't there a Canadian guy who fell in disrepute with the law, who was involved with the New Victory Theater? When it opened, I met some guy, and then the next thing I knew, he was sent away to jail.
No one was sent away to jail for the New Victory Theater, thank God.
No one ever will. No one ever.
Alex, I wonder whether you might comment. We have quite. All right, Ted Lehman.
I just want to say that there were several passionate people during that era. It never could have happened without them. Fred Papert, who lived in the old McGraw-Hill building, brought people there, and was passionate. Tamastar, whose family did signs and turned off the lights.
Please, you microphone, please. Microphone.
How about the Mickey Mouse watch?
Yes. Yes.
She timed the descent of the ball, which was stagehands and ropes in those days, not the way it is now. And it was Tamastar's watch that controlled the descent and made New Year's Eve possible, and it was a Mickey Mouse watch.
Last but not least, Ada Louise Huxtable, who, by being on a committee that had to criticize the Philip Johnson plan, did it eloquently and with her passion. And all of those people really added to the government good deeds and the design deeds to make it happen. And it really was a wonderful time of transformation.
Well, it's about time to conclude, and I think it's clear from our perspectives tonight that there are many Times Squares, not just the two of the physical place, but the one with each decade, one with each year perhaps, and many lenses on Times Square. But I thought in order to conclude the evening, I would read from an editorial notebook that Herb Sturz wrote back on August 6, 1988 in the New York Times, where he went right after becoming the leaving the Department of City Planning and the chairmanship. And he wrote a reflective piece on their actions in Times Square, and I'll read just a very small part of it, but it leaves us the open questions. He wrote, what many Americans think of as the heart of New York is changing with volcanic force. Gaping holes along Broadway and 7th Avenue expose granite subsurface. That's Noetta's design now, in Midtown near Times Square. For a brief moment, you can see the long-concealed structures like the Hotel Edison on 47th Street from blocks away. It's a rare, almost archaeological moment in history, one that gives me personal pangs, perhaps of pride, perhaps of anxiety. For when I served in city government, I had a hand in the policy changes that encouraged this rush of change. Now, as a private citizen, I walk along asking myself with more than usual urgency, did we do it right? He talks about it much more, and I can leave you this URL in order to explore his longer thoughts on it, but we've come to answer, did we do it right tonight? And I think there are still many opinions, but from many perspectives of economic development, one might make the point Times Square is the most visited tourist attraction in the world today. From a populist perspective, even though it may have a different character, Times Square remains as vital, and I think Hugh used the word populist, as it has been in any moment in its history. So we thank you all for what you did then, 30 years ago, and tonight.